I want to thank both of you for holding this hearing this morning, and I'd like to thank the distinguished panel members for sharing their insights. It seems to me that the proper regulation and supervision of our banks requires a balancing act to ensure both the stability of our financial system and that of banks, like our community banks, which did not cause the financial crisis, which are unduly burdened by regulation. I'm going to ask my first question to Mr. Tony Bland, as well as Doreen Eberly, and third, Marianne Hunter. Each of your agencies has expended a lot of time and resources in developing targeted regulatory relief for community banks. How are asset thresholds helpful or harmful in, one, ensuring the safety and soundness of our community banks, and secondly, in providing flexibility in the regulatory framework so as to not unduly burden community banks?
Representative, the asset thresholds are merely a pointer in terms of what may be a cluster of institutions that may have a certain treatment. For example, 80% of the institutions that we supervise are less than $1 billion in assets. And so when you look at that grouping of banks, you see some characteristics in terms of they're locally owned, locally operated, and that's the kind of a focus you put on that. But that's just the beginning of it. You have to look and see what their marketplace is like, what are the complexity of their operations, what type of staff they have, the ability of the staff, the size of the staff, and the operations of the institution. Are they pretty much brick and mortar, or are they involved in internet-type activities? So the thresholds are a pointer. Where it gets challenging, though, is when that becomes the only reference to what a bank can do or not do just based on size. So that's where this issue comes in. And so we would be wary of rules that would limit the flexibility, and that would be counter to safety and soundness or consumer protection safeguards.
Thank you. Ms. Eberly?
Thank you. I would agree. We use a definition for community banks that is focused on the characteristics of the institution. So,
would you speak up a little bit louder, please?
Yes, certainly. We use a definition of community banks that's focused on the characteristics of the institution. So similar to what Mr. Bland said, local relationship, core deposit funded, a relatively small geographic area, so that they're actually dealing with their customers face-to-face. They know their customers. For us, that's 94% of institutions under $10 billion meet that definition and have those characteristics. It's harder to define that with an asset threshold. It's easier with the characteristics of the institution and the way that it operates. I want to pick up on one thing that Mr. Bland said, which is flexibility. Where statutes have bright lines, thresholds, it makes it a little bit more difficult for us to exercise flexibility. One example of that would be with stress testing. And so we don't have a lot of discretion in how we apply the rules with the asset thresholds that are set.
Ms. Hunter?
Yes, I would agree. When we also, we determine a definition of community banks, we do have a threshold of $10 billion. It's really more for the convenience of being able to identify the population of banks that fall into a certain group and how we manage our examination programs. I will say that the vast majority of community banks are actually under $1 billion in assets. So in some sense, the $10 billion threshold is not where our primary focus is. I do agree that it does, hardline thresholds do limit flexibility, yet at the same time it also can be difficult. Usually whenever you draw a line and say a certain bank fits a certain category or doesn't, there's a lot of argument back and forth about who's right on the line and going over on the other side. So having a clear definition does help a little bit in just adding clarity to the group of banks and understanding where that line is drawn. I would like to add one other comment, and that is we have examiners in each of our 12 reserve banks, and as the other agencies have them local. They understand these banks, and that's part of the flexibility comes from the local knowledge that the examination teams have about those institutions, their risks, their business model, their strategies, and the strength of their management teams. And so we do incorporate that into how we think about how we supervise individual institutions.
My time has expired. I wish I had more time to ask some other questions. With that, I yield back.
Thank